Hello Internet, and welcome to what might actually very possibly be the last video I'm going to do with this particularly shitty setup of basically shooting everything on my iPhone and using a even more shitty microphone plugin to set iPhone, because I have finally actually gone out and bought myself a decent microphone. And very soon I will also be buying a decidedly webcam, so I can actually start putting things on my computer and taping it directly to the computer and do some proper editing and so on. Of course, as you can see, I'm not actually in my house, but when I get back to my house, I will have my natural green wall green screen, so I might actually be able to do some fun stuff, which is, well, it's interesting in my opinion. So anyway, back to it. What are we talking about today? Well, this is a pure speculation video, and I haven't done one of those since forever, but it's a pure speculation video where I'm kind of talking about various old Norse gods and how they might have ended up the way they are, how they might have become the characters we know from popular myth, try to trace them back as much as possible in not necessarily direct line, but you know, the influences that might have led them to become the kind of gods that they ended up being. Again, reminder, this is pure speculation. I am basing it as much as possible on historical and linguistic evidence and so on, but in the end this is just my opinion about how things should, or rather could, have worked out. Yeah, I've already done one about Odin, so I won't do that again. I will link below the video I did on his particular origin as I speculate on it. You will also notice a glaring omission in Thor, and that's just because he is so important to the, how to put it, the cultural zeitgeist right now with the Marvel movies and everything, that I want to do a specific video on him rather than lump him together with a lot of other gods. So yeah, I've already been speaking for more than 2 minutes, so I think we just get on with it, shall we? Enjoy. Well, let's start with Balder. Why Balder? Well, because God of War is out right now and he seems to be a major character in that one. So, you know, zeitgeist and all that. Who was Balder? Balder was one of the sons of Odin and the brother of Thor and the others, and he was the god of the sun and light and summer and purity and all that kind of stuff. And he was an interesting kind of god because he was one of those gods who was probably quite popular during the Viking era, but not particularly, I don't know, it's hard to explain. He wasn't as crazily popular as someone like Thor or, of course, Odin or any of the others. Say rather, he was one of the more respected gods. But that's not what we're here to talk about. If you want to know who Balder is, you can do a quick Wikipedia search. So, who was he? Where does he come from? Well, personally, considering his, how to call it, areas of influence or spheres of influence, I would particularly place him from two major sources. Possibly I would say that he was a bit older than at least some of the northern gods, in as much as I would probably place him in the particular position of a surviving Bronze Age deity. In the Bronze Age, the Nordics, I have already in my video about the Cimbrian Wars talked about my belief that there was a pre-Celtic a cultural empire stretching across much of northern, western and central Europe. In the Bronze Age, where these people were, they were seemingly primarily worshipping the sun disk or the sun as a primary deity, and because Balder has to do with the sun and because he is attested apparently fairly largely good amount of time back, my best guess is that he stems partially from that position as a sort of survivor of the old Bronze Age style sun deity, probably mixed with other sun gods during the migration periods when the people who would later become the Norsemen was pushed ahead of various other tribes by the invading Huns and eventually coalesced in northern Germany and the Scandinavian peninsula. What else? Well, as anyone can tell, there is some evidence of probable influence from Apollo, obviously. A lot of their things are the same, while Balder didn't to the same degree has had poetry as part of his domains. All of the northern gods were, of course, very focused on, being well-spoken and doing the poetry of the Nordic realms, because that was just part of the concept, really. That might, of course, have been a pre-Celtic thing also. Personally, I believe it was actually from the Celts, who, after all, kept bardic lore as a very important part of their culture. So at this particular point, there might have been filtered something of Apollo up through the Central European areas to mix up with the older Bronze Age sun god in order to create Balder. But obviously we are not completely done yet. Particularly, it's also worth noticing, as you see in this particular picture, his wife Nanna. And Nanna is basically a female version of Balder, and a very passive goddess. This is, of course, not always unusual in goddesses, but in this particular case, she is in fact very, very passive, and you only hear about her when dealing with Balder, and usually only in, you don't really know much about her because she's just there without actually having, actions or much of a personality. Which leads me to believe that one of the primary examples of, or primary influences rather, for Balder is, of course, also Jesus Christ. It fits with a lot of things: the youth, the purity, the light, the justice, and so on and so on and so on. And considering the fact that most of the northern gods wouldn't really have coalesced into their current shapes until somewhere between the 5th and the 7th century, I would consider at least some Christian influence on Balder to be an almost given. So yeah, that is my Balder theory, basically. He was a slight or sliver of a survivor of the old primary Bronze Age sun god in the north, mixed with the elements of Jesus Christ and Apollo. And of course, Jesus Christ also already have, at least in its later stages, not in the original Mid-Eastern style, but at least in the later Roman-inspired Christianity, some elements of Apollo as well, which I don't particularly need to go in here too. But yeah, that's my idea about how Balder came to being. Further elements of Christianity can, of course, also be seen in the fact that Balder is one of those who are scheduled, if you want to call it that, or fated to survive Ragnarok. In fact, after Ragnarok, he will rise from the dead and become the ruler of the new earthly heaven or earthly paradise that will be created and in the new world. So yeah, anyone with even the slightest sliver of knowledge about how Christianity works will of course see the combinations there. So yeah, that was Balder. Ancient Roman god of the sun and poetry, Apollo, mixed with Christianity and overlain on a surviving Bronze Age supreme sun god to create, the god we today know as Balder. Next, let's move on to Tyr, god of war, more specifically the sort of ordered war, battle lines, strategy, tactics, and so on, rather than just war in and of itself, as well as justice. Now, Tyr is an interesting case because we actually know pretty well where Tyr come from. Tyr was originally the high god of at least the peoples that brought him. His modern day name springs from the old Indo-European word deus, which was basically, well, it basically means god, and it was the name of the Indo-European high god, or the highest god, or the leader of the gods, or the primary god, whatever you want to call it, of the Indo-European people who originally left the plains of northern India and migrated into Europe and into Western Europe eventually. So Tyr is probably the second oldest of the Nordic gods, actually. I mean, not, of course, in mythology, but in as a historical figure or character or whatever you want to call it. There is, in my opinion, one that goes beyond that, but I'll get back to that later in the video. Anyway, Tyr was, as I said, in its origin, the high god of the Indo-European migrants into Europe during the probably late Stone Age, early Bronze Age periods. And as such, his rather sort of strange spheres of influence, war and justice, is not as surprising as it could be. Also, of course, during the olden eras, war and justice were often seen to be in the same sort of style. I mean, both of them were spheres of combat, after all. War seems obvious, but even justice refers to law, which can be considered a battle between several people and so on. And also, like I said, a good king must, of course, be able to wage war and dispense law and justice in equal measures. So, is that it? Is he simply just the old Indo-European high god who remained surviving within his people's cultural inheritance until such time as he was more or less displaced by the later developments of Odin and Thor and so on? Well, yes and no. I think he was also mixed with a character, if you want to call it that, or a persona that was itself a modification of the original deus. If you notice the fact that one of the signs of Tyr's fallen status, if you want to call it that, is of course the loss of his hand to the Fenris wolf. And if you notice that, you will notice how much that sort of parallels some of the rules and legends and so on regarding the Celtic High Kings, specifically seen, of course, in the High Kings of Ireland that had to be physically perfect in order to rule. Losing a hand meant basically losing your ability to govern and losing your ability to be the perfect individual that was needed in order to be king, especially during those days when kingship and not necessarily godhood, but at least religious position had a great deal of overlap. And with that overlap, it sort of makes sense that the, shall we say, Celtic ideals of high kingship was probably devolved from their ideals about the, king of the gods or ruler of the gods. Now, as I have said several times, the stock of the people who eventually became the Danes and the Swedes and the old Norse Scandinavians were probably not of Celtic origins. And this is where the whole thing sort of creates an interesting dynamic, because we have, in this particular case with Tyr, two traditions stemming from the same individual, namely the Indo-European high god. We have the tradition that would basically become Tyr, probably mixed during the time when his status was declining in favor of the newer developed gods like Thor and Odin and so on, mixed, as I said, with the traditions of the Celtic High Kings, which was also probably developed in its, at least, origin from the concept of that particular high god. So, in my opinion, Tyr who, by the way, while I say his status is declining, that is actually something that I have wanted to talk about and might talk about again later, because it's an interesting way his status declined. Yes, his status declined. Odin became the High Lord of the Gods. Thor became probably the most popular god, and certainly, the strongest of the Aesir, the mightiest warrior, and so on, blah, 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 blah. But even then, Tyr was always the one who could kinda sort of match them. If you talked about the one who was as powerful and wise, as clever and brave as Odin and so on, Tyr was the one who could almost match him. If you talk about the ones who was as strong as Thor, well, no one was as strong as Thor. Almost all of the legends basically talk about how his strength was rather phenomenal. But whenever you talked about the one who might have been able to measure up to him, it was Tyr. So even though he lost his status, it was obvious that he was still heavily venerated by people. It was like the best of the rest. I know that doesn't sound as lovely nowadays to be the best of the rest, but when we're talking about deities whose status is declining in the light of new religions, that's actually a pretty fair job to maintain that position. But anyway, back to my overall theory. Tyr, as he would become in the Viking Age, is, in my opinion, a mixture of two characters descending from the same overall individual. Deus, the high king of the gods in Indo-European culture, mixed by two different peoples into the same sort of character, then throwing those two together to create Tyr as an overall god. Next in line, Loki. The trickster, the helper, the clever one, the cunning one, the villain, if you will, though that is probably not understanding how the Nordic saw that kind of thing. And yes, to a certain degree, the wooby. To anyone who knows what that particular term means. In that particular way, of course, Tom Hiddleston's portrayal is not too far off, even if, of course, Marvel's concept of the Nordic gods are somewhat lacking from a mythology perspective, if you ask me. But then, of course, it is a comic and a movie series, so I don't really expect the greatest thing of, shall we say, mytho-historical accuracy. Anyway, who was Loki? Well, if you remember having watched the video I did about Odin previously, I made the statement that Odin was this weird mixture of trickster and wise king and war god. And this is where I think the trickster character came in. I think the trickster character was actually Loki. I think Loki is an interesting kind of god that probably was a fully formed deity in and of himself from one of the peoples that would eventually coalesce into the Old Norse cultural circle during the 5th and 6th century. But that he was, or at least part of him was taken and mixed with the war high king god aspects of Attila that would eventually then fuse into the modern Odin character, or rather they took the aspects of Attila, mixed it with the already existing forest god of Wotan, mixed it again with some of the aspects of Loki, and then turned it into Odin. But again, watch the video I've done on Odin previously, it will more or less explain everything better than I can during this time. So, why do I say that? Well, first of all, historical evidence does tend to show that Loki probably, in the early days of the Norse people, had a much higher profile than he later got, or more specifically perhaps had a much higher, shall we call it, I know it's difficult when talking about gods, but let's call it a social profile than he later received. That he was probably, in fact, one of the top gods in the earlier parts of the mythos, rather than what he became later, which was, of course, the sort of cunning trickster and helper of Thor. He mostly, in many ways, became Thor's sidekick for most of his career until he turned to, well, evil at the end of it. That's actually a thing that's very strange about Loki's character, and I need to put here so I can talk about it a bit later. For most of his career, if you look at the myth, while Loki was cunning and not exactly fulfilling, the role of big warrior guy that was so venerated during the Viking era, he was never a bad guy in any way. He was absolutely loyal to the gods and helped them. Yes, he played tricks on them and he did some dirty tricks now and then, but when push came to shove, he was absolutely on the side of the Aesir, despite being, half a Jotun himself and only Odin's blood brother and so on, which, again, I will get back to. But he was always on the god side, and then suddenly, out of the blue, he decides to murder Balder. For no particular reason, apparently, other than he thought it might be fun? Or, I don't know, no one ever gave a chance. At which point, of course, he was punished and will be on the side of, well, chaos and evil from there on until the end. But the point that I wish to make is that Loki was originally a much more prominent god that he became, and the fact that he, while not disappearing in any way, because he was a, significant part of the mythos, he, again, like Tyr, declined in importance. But this is where I said the thing about being Odin's blood brother. He obviously had to be connected to the gods some way or the other. And I think it basically happened because, as one of the bigger gods, part of whose personality was taken into Odin to become the trickster, he sort of had to, from a social mythological perspective, had to be connected to Odin somehow. People knew he was connected to Odin somehow because it was his, personality that became part of Odin, but at the same time, of course, this was the 5th and 6th century, or even perhaps a little bit prior or a little bit later than that. So he became Odin's blood brother, which, in my opinion, just, he could have been some guy or some other Aesir, but his connection with Odin basically, in my opinion, serves to prove my thesis regarding that he became Thor's helper and so on. Again, also sort of to me indicates that he was originally like a trickster helper god to, call upon when you needed cunning and wisdom, but of course not to be completely trusted. And as Thor rose in popularity, such a god would eventually, get in to help him as the wise helper. Such a character could also well be said to have a lot of other, character traits thrown upon him that he might not originally have. This could have been the reason why he so seamlessly seemed to slot into a lot of myths where he tricks the gods and play them out against each other, yet is always forgiven and is always just, expected to be on their side at the end, because in all probability Loki always was on their side at the end, but since his personality fit the cunning trickster character so very well, he would then have been placed in a situation where whenever they needed, the teller of the stories or the maker of the stories needed the cunning villain, so to speak, even if not necessarily always in a villain position, well, Loki was the obvious choice. However, I fear I have blathered too much on about his sort of role in the actual mythos, which is not exactly what I wanted to talk about in this particular video. So, to summarize, if you will, I think Loki was one of the gods who actually probably changed the least. He was probably a fully formed deity, or character at least, from one of the tribes, or some of the tribes of the people that eventually coalesced into the Old Norse, whose role was absorbed by the rising god Odin, and who was then slotted into the sort of cunning trickster, jack of all trades character in the overall mythos. This explains his helper role, because he had always been, the perhaps not to be trusted, but always to be called upon helper, which slots him into the Thor position, while also being in that position where, when you needed the villain, he could go into that position as well. So yeah, an original creation, if you will, an original god that kept his position while parts of his personality were absorbed into other gods, is my theory about Loki. Now let's turn to Freya. And Freya is a bit of an odd duck when it comes to her spheres of influence. Love, beauty, sex, fertility, and war and, death. She is obviously, in her role as the war deity, probably connected with the whole concept of the Valkyries, but at the same time, you primarily know her as, the goddess of beauty and fertility. Now, as I have already mentioned in my video about Nordic mythology overview as such, which I will also link below, Freya was, in all probability, a sort of split from an original goddess that also included Frigga, the wife of Odin. More evidence of that is, of course, seen in the fact that Freya is referred to as Od's woman, Odie's woman, and Odd is, of course, based in his original, just the original stem of the word Odin. So, in all probability, Freya was also Frigg, or at least in her original role, was also Frigg as the goddess of, wisdom and wifely duties, just being a wife and the queen and home and hearth and child rearing and all of that stuff. So, where did she come from? That is the important bit. Well, this is where I think we have the one deity that is older in origin than Tyr. I personally believe, without, of course, any real evidence, but I personally believe that with all of those positions rolled into one, home, God, home, children, hearth, love, beauty, fertility, and war, and so on, that, in my opinion, she was probably the last remaining sliver, if you want to call it that, of the early Stone Age mother goddess, the, Earth Mother. If Jeff Holiday is watching this, yes, the Earth Mother. But, yeah, that's basically my concept of where Freya originally stemmed from. She was the prehistoric Earth goddess, or All Mother, or whatever you want to call it, which of course, characterized all of these particular traits, which always remained, even during the worship of the sun disk during the Bronze Age, as the societies became, well, I hate to use the term, but more and more patriarchal in their style of how they structured their mythology and so on. Freya was always there. Or at least that character was always there. The fact that Freya has her twin brother Frey, who basically has the same spheres of influence as she has, except that he is focused as much upon, agriculture as actual human fertility, though, of course, the fact that his primary characteristic is an enormously erected phallus shows that, of course, that was not foreign to him. Basically, to me, also suggests that that particular god might actually originally have been part of maybe a duality deity that was, half male or male and female at the same time, basically an overall fertility goddess, which to my mind also springs back to the original concept of the All-Mother or Mother Goddess. So when did she split from Frigg and the, possibly other of the Aesir women? Well, It's difficult to say, but again, I would have to assume that it was sometime during the migration period when several people joined together or was forced and mashed together with various concept of this mother goddess character. Of course, there are several all around the world. There are Isis in the Middle East, various others. To a certain degree, probably Baba Yaga in Russia can be said to eventually spring back from, the original mother goddess, just mythologized and monsterized during later mythological developments. But probably a couple of the peoples were ones that, had an existing concept of this all-mother survivor sliver as a fertility goddess, while another one had the same sort of thing that just had been a bit more, shall we say, domesticated into the character that would be the Frigga character. And as the cultures match, both deities were sort of forced into the same, or rather, forced out of the same slot, and in order to accommodate both of them, became Frigga and Freya. Anyway, that is basically my theory about Freya, that she was the surviving aspect or surviving concept of the prehistoric all-mother, Earth Mother, call it what you want, matriarchal goddess that has been very well, of course, identified almost throughout the entire world. Of course, to further that particular theory is the fact that she was, according to current mythology, if you want to call it that, part of the original Vanir tribe, the tribe of other gods, that fought with the Aesir for complete dominance, and during a ceasefire or truce or whatever you want to call it, basically exchanged hostages to become part of the other tribe. Now, Mimir, who I might get back to in another video, was part of that, and of course the Aesir from the Vanir got Njord, the sea god, plus his children, Frey and Freya. Now, the Vanir was basically always said to dwell in the underworld, while the Aesir, of course, were high in the heavens. So why would the Vanir have a, goddess of fertility and agriculture? Well, probably because, in my opinion, the Vanir is a sort of later explanation of where a lot of those deities that didn't really fit the mold came from. They already had a suggestion with Loki, who was half Jotun and so on, was adopted into the the Aesir. In my opinion, the Vanir was just yet another way to explain. They were never actually existing in mythology as a fully formed tribe. It was more like gods that was not part of the original dominant cultural mythology, but was taken into it for various reasons, were probably relegated to have been part of the Vanir during the cultural development. Anyway, I don't think I have more to say about Freya right now. The original mother goddess turned into a split character that each of those splits inhabiting parts of the original sort of character's traits. And finally, Njord, god of the sea. And no, I cannot blame you if after a video of this particular length you also said, well, bloody finally. Anyway, Njord, the god of the sea. Where did Njord come from? Well, there is a certain degree of agreement among scholars, and I see absolutely no reason to not join that agreement, that he originally was Nerthus, a Germanic-style fertility goddess from around the early Iron Age, and which was at least worshipped during the early Roman imperial days, as he is well attested from, at least Roman writings upon, the Germanic people. So, we basically have probably Nerthus was already connected to the sea. Probably Nerthus herself was originally also like a sliver of the original mother goddess, who then basically, as time progressed, became just the sort of overall fertility slash food slash agriculture slash whatever goddess, but still hold great importance during the for the Germanic people that lived around the Baltic during the early Roman days. There, in fact, can be some evidence to be said, since Njord is, of course, the father of Frey and Freya, that Nerthus was also part of the being that eventually morphed into Freya and the other sort of created slivers of the All-Mother that I talked about during the previous goddess. Well, I talked about that for like 2 minutes ago, so I don't think you have forgotten it. However, how did Njord become a man? Well, again, I think we are having a mixture of several characters here. Njord, as he existed, was, in my opinion, probably a more localized sea god and god for fishermen from presumably Norway, actually, in my opinion, based upon just the structure of his name and the fact that he was always obviously I'm saying he was always most popular in the sort of Norwegian held areas. He's also described, of course, as one of the old kings of Sweden, by those who didn't particularly think the Aesir was God, but was historical figures who were deified by, heathen non-Christian people, which is also absolutely very possible. I might very well say that Nerthus, the goddess, existed, was then mixed with the sort of, as the mother goddess was pushed a bit more to the background with the rise of particularly perhaps the warrior gods, she was then probably during the mixture of the peoples, again during the migration periods, as those tribes pushed into Norway, or rather the tribes that lived around the Baltic was pushed further north by the arriving migration people and then pushed into Norway. She was probably mixed with, since she had sea connections, mixed with the already existing male god of there, or even a female god of there, to create a more, so we say, specialized sea god, losing much of her all-mother tendencies in the process, and then very possibly being connected with this very famous, wise, and princely ruler of the Swedes. Further evidence of this can be said to be the one I sort of quote in my Freya part of the video, namely the fact that Njord, for obvious reasons, as the father of Frey and Freya, was also one of the original Vanir hostages that eventually basically became Aesir as the Vanir disappeared. Or, in my opinion, the Vanir didn't really disappear. They became the Dark Elves, or, partially the inhabitants of the underworld that wasn't part of Hell, or the Nordic version of Hell, as they was removed from godhood to themselves be degraded. But of course, he was part of those Vanir, who I've already said, in my opinion, is basically the sort of catch-all tribe from whenever the later early proto-Old Norse cultural people took gods that already existed in the area they came to and adopted them into their own, shall we say, gestating mythology. Interestingly enough, while I always say that this as a pure speculation video is one where you should take my opinion as just my opinion and everything with a grain of salt, well, I mean, it's very difficult to talk about historical facts when we're talking about a pre-literate society and discussing their mythology's cultural historical roots. But of all the gods I talk about in this particular video, Njord is actually probably the one where I feel the most certain in how the god was developed. Not because we have better historical evidence, except of course the very well attested Nerthus and the very well attested sort of Norwegian fisherman's god. No, it's because he is in fact a sea god, which makes me pretty damn certain that his origins would have had to be around the Baltic, where his later followers was, of course, the fishermen and seafarers there. Almost all of the other Nordic gods have actually very little to do with the sea, which is very interesting considering just how important the sea travel and, naval life was to the Nordics as a people. But all of their gods pretty clearly at least have parts of their roots in either, either the forest and mountains of Central Europe or the plains and mountains of Eastern Europe towards the steppes of Russia. I mean, not that they are Russian steppe gods, but that they at least have sort of evidence that sort of people would have created them, if you can talk about gods being created in that fashion. While Njord clearly is a far more localized deity, and with the possible exception of Freya, presumably the most original of the Nordic gods, despite not actually being officially part of the pantheon, but not part of the tribe of the gods. So yeah, that's again, that's why Njord is interesting to me. It might not be that interesting to people who don't have my cultural background as a Scandinavian, but Anyway, that is, in my opinion, Njord. Another sliver of the all-mother fertility goddess that also spawned Freya and Frigg and probably the Valkyries, to be perfectly honest, mixed with an already existing fisherman's and sea god, probably maybe also mixed with an actual sort of legendary historical figure into becoming the sea god that we know as Njord. Well, that was it. There we are then. My personal theory about the development and evolution, you might call it, of some of the northern gods. I hope you basically enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. Like I said, I will eventually do a video specifically on Thor. I'm also thinking about doing not just the gods, but other concepts of northern myth, like the various realms and the various monsters and demons and giants and so on, the Jotuns, the children of Loki, as I mentioned during his particular segment. I'm kind of hoping to maybe do a collaboration with White Sith Male, the terrible Swede. But in this particular case, I'm willing to at least give him the fact that he's a fucking Scanian rather than a fucking Swede, so, it will at least be acceptable, I suppose, if we absolutely have to, but yeah. Well, again, like I said, that got away from me. I hope you enjoyed this. I will return to this. I might return to another general video. I might also eventually have to do another travel video, even though they are so terribly unpopular, but one person seems to like them at least, so I'm making them for her, if nothing else. But yeah, until next time, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.